So let's have a sesh on sources of finance and how to evaluate it. So the first place to start is, well, have you done a cash flow forecast? Because if you're considering which type of finance you're going to use, it's probably a good step to have done a cash flow forecast to inform you or to inform management of their decision and making sure that they make the best decision. Secondly is, have you considered the amount of finance that you need? Do you need a small amount or do you need a big amount? If you need a small amount of finance, or relatively speaking anyway, you might want to go to internal finance first. And if it's a small amount, well then you look, do you have the cash available? Or do you have the working capital available, being the difference between current assets and current liabilities? Next, have you considered the time frame that you need your sources of finance for? For example, if you've decided that it's a short-term source of finance that you need and you don't have it internally in terms of cash or working capital, then you'll need to look externally. An obvious place for short-term external finance will be an overdraft, for example. But if you're looking for long-term finance, so the time frame is for the long term, possibly because it's a large amount of finance that you need, well then you might want to consider fixed asset sales. So if you've got any excess or surplus fixed assets, can you sell them and convert them into cash? Or you might want to use the retained profits, the historical profits the business has made. The next thing to consider is the type of business. Because if you are faced with unlimited liability, so you're a sole trader or you're a partnership, well then you don't have the availability to use equity. So if you're going to look to finance a project, then it's going to have to come from long-term debt, for example, a bank loan. But if you are not faced with unlimited liability and you are in fact a company, so you have limited liability, then you have the option of debt in the long term, or you have the option of equity. So you can go with shares, for example. So if you've got to make that decision between debt or equity because you're a company with limited liability, well then you need to consider what the cost of this external finance is in order for you to choose the best source of finance, either being debt or equity. And that's going to depend on some key points, the it depends on points. And these are, well, number one is, what is the interest rate right now? Because if the interest rate is low, well then it makes sense to use debt. You also might want to consider the existing debt you have in your business. How much long-term debt do you already hold? Sometimes this is referred to as the gearing ratio. But your existing debt, if you already have lots of existing debt, then you might want to consider the fact that you don't want to take on any more debt, and that might persuade you to go the equity angle. The next thing you want to consider is the risk of the business. Does the business make predictable profits year on year? If that's the case, then it makes sense to use debt, because you can predict how much your profits are likely to be each year, so you know how much debt you can take on and therefore what your interest payments are going to be. But if you make really volatile, unpredictable profits, sometimes you may make a loss, for example, then it may make sense to take on equity as an option. The reason why is because dividends are optional, versus if you take a bank loan, you've got to make those interest payments back. So if you are a volatile business and very risky, it makes sense to take on equity because dividends are optional. The next point you might want to consider is existing shares, because if you decide to take the equity route and you issue shares over 50%, then you have the possibility, the risk that you will no longer have voting control in your business. And if you don't have voting control in your business, you might not be able to strategically make a decision of where the business will go in the future. And that's a big consideration as a founder of a business if you want to let the control go. So these are all factors that it depends on when you make this decision between long-term debt or long-term equity. But the key thing to think about is that there's an ideal source of finance. And the key thing for you for these questions is you know which source of finance, what the pros are of it, what the cons are of it, and you're able to justify why that source of finance makes sense for that business. And if you know your pros and your cons, you'll be able to answer that. And in terms of your evaluation, oh so critical, a good way to think about it is tact. Tact is a good mnemonic to think about, being time frame, amount of finance, cost externally, and the type of business. I hope that helps, and I'll see you at the next sesh.